I remember the exact moment I knew my life was a lie. It wasn't when I found the texts. It wasn't when I noticed she started wearing perfume to run errands. It wasn't even the night she came home at 2 a.m. with a story so rehearsed it sounded like she'd practiced it in the car. No. The moment I knew everything was a lie was when a stranger sat down at my dinner table, looked up at my face, and reached for his phone to call his lawyer. But to understand that moment, you have to understand who I was before it happened. You have to understand what I had built, what I believed in, and what I was willing to ignore to protect it. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 39 years old. I grew up in a small town in rural Tennessee where the biggest event of the year was the county fair, and everybody knew everybody else's business before they knew it themselves. My father was a contractor. My mother was a school nurse. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling. We were just steady, predictable, safe. And I think that's what I always chased in life. That feeling of safety. That feeling that the ground beneath your feet was solid and wasn't going anywhere. I worked hard, harder than most people I knew. I put myself through college studying corporate law and business management, taking night shifts at a 24-hour diner just to cover my textbooks. I graduated with honors at 24, landed a junior position at a mid-level corporate firm in Nashville, and spent the next 5 years doing nothing but working, learning and saving every dollar I could. By the time I was 30, I had built something real, a genuine career in corporate acquisitions, a small but growing reputation as someone who could walk into a failing business, diagnose the problem in 72 hours, and either save it or strip it clean. Companies hired me when things got complicated, when the numbers didn't add up, when someone somewhere had done something that needed to be quietly fixed before it became a public disaster. I was, in short, someone who was very good at finding the truth, which makes what happened next one of the most painful ironies of my entire life. Because the one place I never thought to look for a lie was inside my own home. I met Camille at a charity gala in the spring of 2014. She was standing near the bar, wearing a green dress that made everyone else in the room look like they were dressed for the wrong event. She had this laugh, this full, unashamed laugh that cut right through the stiff, polished noise of the room. I introduced myself. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds before she said, "You look like someone who takes himself too seriously." I told her she was probably right. We talked for 3 hours that night, about everything and nothing, about growing up in small towns, about the particular loneliness of being ambitious in a world that wants you to be comfortable, about favorite books and bad habits and the kind of music you listen to when nobody's watching. By the end of the night, I knew I was in trouble. We dated for 2 years. I proposed on a Tuesday, not a special Tuesday, not a planned occasion, just an ordinary Tuesday evening when we were sitting on the kitchen floor eating takeout noodles. And I looked at her and thought, I don't want a single day without this person in it. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We got married in October 2016. Small ceremony, 40 people. Her mother cried through the entire thing. My father shook my hand afterward and told me she was the real deal. High praise from a man who expressed love mainly through firm handshakes and practical advice. The first 3 years were good, not perfect. Nothing real is ever perfect, but genuinely, solidly good. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. We talked about children in that careful, hopeful way couples do when the idea still feels like a warm possibility rather than a pressure. We had routines and rituals and inside jokes and all the invisible architecture that makes a life feel like a home. And then somewhere around year 4, something shifted. I couldn't point to the exact moment. That's the cruel thing about the slow erosion of a marriage, and it doesn't announce itself. There's no earthquake, no dramatic declaration. There's just a slow, quiet pulling away, like a tide going out. And you keep telling yourself it'll come back in. Camille started working later. At first it was once a week, then twice. Then it became the norm. She was working in marketing for a property development firm, a job she'd taken about 18 months into our marriage, and she told me things were getting busier. Bigger clients, more responsibility. I believed her. Of course I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She started going to networking events on Friday evenings, started having client dinners that ran past midnight, started coming home carrying the kind of silence that doesn't come from exhaustion. It comes from carrying something you don't want to put down, I noticed. I'm a man who notices things for a living. Of course I noticed. But I made a choice I'm not proud of, to not look too closely. Because I was afraid of what I might find, and because part of me believed that if I just worked harder, if I was just more present, more attentive, more everything, maybe whatever was pulling her away would stop pulling. So I worked harder. I came home earlier. I made reservations at restaurants she'd mentioned wanting to try. I bought her flowers for no reason. I was performing the role of a good husband, with the quiet desperation of a man who already knows on some level that the performance isn't enough. And Camille? She received all of it with a warmth that felt genuine. She kissed me. She thanked me. She said she loved me, and I believed her. God help me, I believed her. The dinner was her idea. It was a Thursday evening in March. I remember because I had just closed a particularly difficult acquisition deal that afternoon, and I came home feeling genuinely good for the first time in weeks. Loose-shouldered, light, the kind of tired that comes from doing something hard and finishing it. Camille was in the kitchen when I got home. She was cooking, actually cooking, which had become rarer over the past year, and the house smelled like garlic and rosemary and something roasting in the oven. She was wearing the blue blouse I'd always loved. Her hair was down. I invited someone for dinner, she said, without turning around. Casual, practiced casual. The kind of casual that isn't actually casual at all. Oh? I set my bag down, loosened my tie. Who? A colleague, she said. Someone from work. I've told you about him. He's been really helpful with the Hartwell account. I thought it would be nice, just a casual dinner, get to know him a little. A colleague, of course. Just a colleague. Sure, I said. What time? 7:30. He's bringing wine. I showered, changed, came back downstairs and helped set the table. Camille was animated in a way I hadn't seen in months, laughing at small things, moving quickly, checking her phone, with the particular kind of focus that looks like distraction but is actually the opposite. I watched her, and I felt it, that cold, creeping feeling in my chest, that feeling I'd been pushing down for months, but I smiled. I set the table. I opened a bottle of water and stood by the kitchen island and waited. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:32 p.m. Camille moved to the door faster than the situation required. I heard her open it, heard the low murmur of voices, her voice bright and welcoming, his voice smooth and confident. Heard the sound of a wine bottle being handed over. Heard her laugh, that laugh, the one I fell in love with. And something about it in that moment sounded different to me. Wrong frequency, too loose. And then they came around the corner into the dining room. Camille was smiling. The man beside her was tall, well-dressed, mid-40s, silver at his temples, the kind of face that looked like it had never experienced a moment of financial anxiety in its entire life. He was already talking, something charming about the neighborhood, about how long it had taken him to find parking. And then he looked up. He looked across the dining room table, and his eyes landed on my face, and everything stopped. His sentence died mid-word. His smile didn't fade. It didn't have time to fade. It just froze. Like a man who has walked confidently into a room and suddenly realized, one step too late, that he has walked off a ledge. I watched the color leave his face. I watched him blink. Once. Twice. And then I watched him reach into his jacket pocket, pull out his phone, and take 3 steps backward toward the hallway. Camille turned to look at him, confused. "Richard? Are you okay?" "Give me 1 second," he said. His voice was still controlled, but underneath it was something raw and scrambling. "Just 1 second." He turned his back to us, and I stood there at my own dinner table, in my own home, watching a man I had never been formally introduced to call his lawyer on a Thursday evening in March. And here's the thing. Here's the thing that Camille didn't know, that Richard didn't know I knew. I recognized him, not from a photograph, not from anything Camille had ever shown me or told me. I recognized him from a file, a very specific, very detailed corporate file that had crossed my desk 14 months earlier. A file involving a land acquisition deal worth nearly $40 million, a deal that had some very serious irregularities buried in it, a deal that had been quietly shelved when the company involved decided the exposure wasn't worth it. The man standing in my hallway calling his lawyer, his name wasn't just Richard. His full name was Richard Calloway III, and 14 months ago I had been hired specifically to investigate him. I never finished that investigation. The client pulled the contract before I got to the end, but I had gotten far enough to know things about Richard Calloway that Richard Calloway would very much prefer no one knew. And now he was standing in my house, having dinner with my wife. And he had just realized, 3 seconds after looking at my face, exactly who I was. I pulled out my chair, sat down calmly, unfolded my napkin and laid it across my lap. "Please," I said, gesturing toward his seat. "Dinner's getting cold." He stared at me from the hallway, phone still in his hand, and I smiled at him. The way you smile at someone when you know exactly what cards they're holding. Because here's what nobody at that table understood yet. Not Camille. Not Richard. Not the lawyer he'd just speed-dialed in a panic. This dinner wasn't the beginning of my problem. This dinner was the beginning of his. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when everyone in it knows something is wrong, but nobody is ready to say it out loud. That was the silence at my dinner table that Thursday night. Richard came back from the hallway, phone put away, face reconstructed into something that almost resembled composure. He sat down across from me, accepted the glass of wine. Camille poured with a hand that was just slightly too steady, the steadiness of effort, not ease, and said something generic about the food smelling wonderful. Camille was looking between us. She had the expression of a woman watching two people she's introduced at a party who clearly have some history she doesn't know about. Unsettled, probing. "Do you two know each other?" she asked finally, directly. Richard looked at me. I looked at Richard. "I don't think we've met formally," I said pleasantly. "Daniel Mercer." I extended my hand across the table. He took it. His grip was firm, deliberate. Message received. He wasn't going to fold in front of her. "Richard Calloway. Good to finally meet you. Camille talks about you often." "Does she?" I thought. "All good things, I hope," I said. "Of course," he said. And we smiled at each other, with the particular warmth of two men who are currently at war and have mutually agreed to postpone the battle until a more appropriate moment. Dinner proceeded. Camille served. Conversation moved through the usual channels. Work, the city, a restaurant that had recently opened downtown. Richard was smooth. Professionally smooth, the kind of smooth that comes from years of expensive rooms and high-stakes negotiations. He was charming to Camille, respectful to me, and said absolutely nothing of substance for 90 straight minutes. I let him. I asked easy questions. Listened with apparent interest. Refilled his wine glass when it got low. Played the gracious, oblivious host with everything I had. Because here's something I learned early in my career. The most dangerous thing you can do to a man who knows you're on to him is make him think you're not paying attention. Let him relax. Let him recalibrate. Let him convince himself that maybe he was wrong. Maybe you don't know what he thinks you know. Maybe this is going to be fine. And then watch what he does next. Richard left at 10:15. He thanked Camille warmly. Shook my hand again at the door. Same firm grip. Same steady eyes and said we should do it again sometime. "Absolutely," I said. I watched his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Then I went back inside, helped Camille clear the dishes, and went to bed. And I lay there in the dark for 4 hours, staring at the ceiling, putting it all together. Let me tell you about the Hartwell account. 14 months before that dinner, I had been approached by a man named Gerald Fitch. Fitch was the general counsel for a mid-sized commercial real estate company based in Atlanta, one of those firms that had grown fast in the post-2008 recovery and was now dealing with the particular problems that come from growing faster than your infrastructure can support. He had hired me quietly and off-book to look into a series of property acquisitions that didn't add up. 3 parcels of land in the Nashville metro area, all acquired within a 12-month window, all purchased at prices significantly below market value, all subsequently flipped or developed in ways that generated enormous profit. The problem wasn't the profit. The problem was the process. Because when I started pulling on the thread, tracking the original sellers, the intermediary LLCs, the chain of title transfers, I started finding a very specific pattern. The sellers in all three cases were not selling voluntarily. Two were elderly landowners who had received legal notices, suggesting zoning issues with their properties, issues that turned out to be fabricated. One was a small family business that had been subjected to a coordinated campaign of code violations, health inspections, and licensing challenges that conveniently dried up the moment they agreed to sell. Someone was manufacturing pressure, creating problems out of thin air to force sales. And the money trail, buried under 4 layers of LLCs and 2 offshore accounts, led to a holding company called Callaway Strategic Partners. Richard Callaway III, solely principal. I had 2 weeks of documented evidence, transaction records, emails recovered from deleted accounts, testimonies from 2 of the original sellers who were, by that point, very interested in talking to someone. And then Gerald Fitch called me, told me the engagement was over, thanked me for my work, transferred my final payment, and told me, very politely and very firmly, to destroy all copies of my findings and never speak of the matter again. I asked him why. He paused for a long time. Then he said, because the people involved are more connected than we initially understood. And I have a family, Daniel. And he hung up. I didn't destroy the files. That's not something I'm capable of doing, walking away from documented wrongdoing and pretending I never found it. But I did shelve it. I locked it in an encrypted drive. I told myself that one day, when the timing was right, it would matter to someone. I just never imagined the timing would announce itself by sitting down at my dinner table. The morning after the dinner, I woke up at 5 a.m. Camille was still asleep. I moved quietly, made coffee, went to my home office and opened the encrypted drive. Everything was still there. Every document, every transaction record, every email thread. I hadn't looked at it in over a year. Reading through it now with the context of last night sitting heavy in my chest was a different experience entirely. Because this time, I wasn't reading it as a corporate investigator trying to follow a money trail. I was reading it as a husband who had just watched his wife's colleague call his lawyer upon seeing his face. And the questions I was now asking were different questions. How long had Camille been working with Callaway Strategic Partners? Her employer, the property development firm she'd worked at for 5 years, specialized in exactly the kind of commercial real estate deals that Callaway's holding company was known for. I had always known that in a vague, general way, but I had never connected it to anything specific. Why would I? I pulled up her firm's public project listings online, scrolled through their recent developments, and there, on a project page for a mixed-use development in Franklin, Tennessee, was the name I was looking for. Callaway Strategic Partners, listed as a financing partner. I sat back in my chair. Franklin, Tennessee, one of the 3 parcels I had investigated 14 months ago. One of the properties that had been acquired using manufactured pressure on the original seller. My wife's firm had developed that property, which meant my wife's firm had, at minimum, done business with a man I had documented evidence of criminal coercion against. The question I was not yet ready to answer, was how deep Camille's knowledge went. Was she an innocent employee of a firm that had unknowingly partnered with a corrupt developer? Entirely possible. These things happen in commercial real estate constantly. You take on a financing partner, you don't always know everything about how they operate. Or had she known? Had she been in some capacity a part of it? I didn't know, not yet. But I knew something else now. Something that changed the geometry of everything. Richard Callaway hadn't just been brought to my dinner table randomly. He had been watching me. For how long, I didn't know. But a man like Callaway, a man with his exposure, his legal vulnerability, his habits of manufactured pressure and coercion, didn't let a threat like me wander around unmonitored. He had known about me, about my investigation, about the files I hadn't destroyed, and he had found the most effective way to keep an eye on me, through my wife. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window and looked out at the quiet morning street. Neighbors walking dogs, a woman in running clothes stretching against a lamppost. The ordinary world continuing at its ordinary pace, completely unaware. My hands were not shaking. I was past shaking. I was thinking. I was thinking about Gerald Fitch saying, "The people involved are more connected than we initially understood." I was thinking about Camille's late nights, her client dinners, her new distance. I was thinking about a man who had looked at my face. across a dinner table and called his lawyer before he even sat down. And I was thinking about one more thing, one detail I had almost overlooked, buried in the original file, that now that I had this new context, lit up like a signal fire. One of the email threads I had recovered 14 months ago included a chain between Calloway and an unnamed intermediary, someone he referred to only as our inside contact at the table. I had never identified that person. The account had been too well scrubbed, the trail too clean. I had assumed it was someone inside the target firms, an employee passing information, but at the table, not in the firm, at the table. A domestic phrase, an intimate phrase. My coffee had gone cold. I didn't notice. I walked back to my desk and opened the encrypted drive again. I had work to do, and this time I was going to finish it. I always tell people the truth is never one thing. The truth has layers, and the deeper you dig, the more you realize that what you thought was the bottom is just another floor. I spent the next 72 hours digging. I didn't sleep more than 3 hours across those 3 days. I ate at my desk. I let calls go to voicemail. I told Camille I was swamped with a new engagement, which wasn't entirely untrue, just not in the way she understood. I started with what I had, the original Calloway file, 3 fraudulent property acquisitions, the shell company structure, the offshore accounts, the 2 elderly sellers who had been legally intimidated into selling, below market value, and I added to it. I knew things now that I hadn't known 14 months ago. I knew the connection to Camille's firm. I knew that Calloway hadn't been spooked by my investigation through some lucky coincidence. He had known about me specifically, which meant he had a source. So I started there. The source. I pulled every available public record I could find on Camille's property development firm, Meridian Properties. SEC filings, state business registrations, property transaction records, court filings, UCC liens, hours of reading, pages of cross-referenced data. And then I found it, buried in a 3-year-old operating agreement amendment for one of Meridian's subsidiary, LLCs, a list of silent investors. 7 names. Most of them were familiar, regional real estate money, nothing unusual. The 7th name was a trust, the Calloway Family Trust. Richard Calloway didn't just do business with Camille's employer occasionally. He was a silent equity partner in one of their core operating subsidiaries. He had been, by the filing date, for at least 4 years, which meant that when Camille got her job at Meridian Properties, a job she had interviewed for, accepted and been excited about, she was, without knowing it, walking into a company that was partially owned by Richard Calloway. At least that's what I told myself at first, that she hadn't known. And then I found the calendar. Let me be clear about something. I am not a man who goes through his wife's phone. I am not a man who installs tracking software or reads private messages or does any of the surveillance things that men in my profession sometimes do in their personal lives. I believe in a certain line between professional capability and personal conduct, and I'd always held that line carefully. But Camille had a shared family calendar. We both did. We'd set it up years ago for scheduling, appointments, dinner reservations, travel, nothing private about it. Both our phones synced to it automatically. She had, I think, forgotten it existed. I opened it on my laptop, and I started scrolling back. The late nights, the client dinners, the networking events, all of them were there, logged with titles like Hartwell Planning Dinner, and CSP Strategy Session, and RC Check-In. RC, Richard Calloway. The first RC check-in on the calendar was dated 19 months ago, which was, I noted with a cold and specific clarity, approximately 3 months before Gerald Fitch had hired me to investigate Calloway's acquisitions. The most recent RC check-in was 6 days ago, 2 days before the dinner party. I scrolled through them, dozens, regular, consistent, spread across 19 months. Some were during work hours, many were not. I am not going to tell you what I felt in that moment because I don't think I have the vocabulary for it. It was not rage, exactly. It was something bigger and quieter than rage. It was the specific devastation of a man who has just had the architecture of his life confirmed as a careful, sustained, premeditated construction. Not a marriage that drifted. Not a woman who made a mistake. A calculated, ongoing relationship conducted parallel to mine for over a year and a half. I closed the laptop. I went and sat in the backyard for a long time. The morning birds were doing what morning birds do, completely indifferent to the fact that a man was sitting 40 feet away watching his understanding of the last 5 years of his life quietly dissolve. Then I went back inside and kept working. Because rage, even the quiet, architectural kind, is only useful if you direct it somewhere. Here is what I now knew. Camille had been in a sustained relationship with Richard Calloway for at least 19 months. Calloway was a hidden equity partner in her employer. Calloway had known about my investigation into his fraudulent acquisitions. Here is what I still didn't know. Had Camille told Calloway about my investigation? Had she known about the fraud? And why had the dinner happened at all? Why bring him to our home? Why introduce them? The third question was the one that bothered me most. It was reckless. Even for someone having an affair, bringing the man to your marital home for dinner was strange. It suggested either extraordinary arrogance or something else, something that hadn't occurred to me yet. I turned it over for most of that second day, and then, late in the evening, I had a thought. What if the dinner wasn't Camille's idea? What if Calloway had wanted to meet me, wanted to look at me directly, assess me, calculate his exposure? What if Camille didn't know about the investigation at all, and Calloway had arranged the dinner himself, using her to see what he was dealing with? It changed the shape of everything. Because if that was true, it meant Camille might be many things. Unfaithful, dishonest, a person who had broken her promises. But she might not be complicit in what Calloway was doing. She might, in fact, be as much a piece on his board as I was. I needed more information. I needed to talk to Gerald Fitch. I found Fitch through a mutual professional contact. It took most of the third day. He was no longer at the Atlanta firm I had left quietly. About 8 months after, pulling my contract, which I noted. He was working as an independent consultant now. Smaller engagements, lower profile. I sent him a message through a secure channel. 3 sentences. I know you remember the Calloway engagement. Something has happened that changes the exposure calculation significantly. I think we need to talk. He called me 40 minutes later. He didn't say hello. He said, "How bad is it?" "Bad," I said, "but manageable if we move carefully. I need you to tell me why you really pulled the contract." A long pause. "Gerald," I said, "I'm not recording this. I'm not building a case against you. I'm a man who just found out his wife has been in a relationship with Richard Calloway for 19 months, and I need to understand what I'm dealing with." Another pause, longer. Then Fitch exhaled slowly and said, "They threatened my daughter." Silence. She was at college in Savannah. One evening, she got into her car and found a photograph on the driver's seat. A photograph of her taken without her knowledge, in her apartment. No note, no message, just the photograph. He stopped. "That was enough," he said quietly. "I pulled the contract the next morning." I gripped the phone. "Richard Calloway did that?" I said. "I never got confirmation. I never tried. I pulled the contract, I transferred your fee, and I left the firm 6 months later." Gerald, in the original email threads I recovered, Calloway referred to someone as his inside contact, someone at the table. I assumed it was corporate espionage, an employee somewhere in the chain. "It wasn't," Fitch said. My chest went very still. "How do you know?" I said. "Because when I told Calloway I was pulling the contract, he already knew why. He knew before I explained. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, 'I appreciate the wise decision. Give my regards to the man who helped us reach it.'" "The man," I said. "The man. Not the investigator, not the consultant, not any professional reference. The man." Something was moving through me that I can only describe as the sensation of a very large and very old lie finally giving way. "He knew I was the one investigating him," I said slowly. "Not just the firm. Me specifically." "Yes," said Fitch. "Which means he had a source close to me specifically," I said. "Not corporate espionage. Something personal." Fitch said nothing. He didn't need to. "Gerald," I said, "how long ago did Calloway know about my investigation?" "When was the first indication?" 3 days after I hired you," he said. "He called me personally." He was very calm about it. He said, and I quote, "I understand you've engaged someone to look at my affairs. I'd encourage you to reconsider that decision." 3 days after Fitch hired me, I thought about the calendar. I thought about the first RC check-in, 19 months ago. I thought about the fact that 14 months ago, when Fitch hired me, Camille and Calloway had already been in contact for 5 months. And I thought about the evening I'd come home, excited about the engagement, and told Camille over dinner that I'd just landed a new corporate investigation, that the client was nervous, that it involved some serious real estate fraud. I hadn't given her names. I hadn't given her details. But I had told her it was real estate fraud, and Calloway had known I was coming for him 3 days later. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. "Daniel," he said before I could hang up, "be careful. He is not a man who responds well to being cornered." "I know," I said. "I mean it." The photograph on my daughter's seat. That was a message. "He sends messages." "I understand," I said. And I did understand. What Calloway hadn't understood, what nobody in this situation seemed to have accounted for, was that sending messages was also something I was very, very good at. If you're going to confront a powerful man, you don't do it on his terms. You don't do it in the spaces he controls, with the people around him who owe him things. You do it in public. You do it where the witnesses are neutral. You do it where walking away from the truth would cost him more than facing it. And you make sure when you do it that you've already moved all your pieces before he knows the game has started. I spent the 2 weeks between the dinner and the gala very quietly and very precisely dismantling Richard Calloway's safety net. I am not going to describe everything I did in those 2 weeks in full detail, not because I'm not proud of it. I am, but because some of it involved professional contacts and legal strategies that are still, at the time I'm telling you this, part of ongoing proceedings. But here's the shape of it. First, I contacted the 2 original property sellers from my 14-month-old investigation. Both were still reachable. Both were still angry. Both had, in the intervening period, spoken to other people who had been subjected to Calloway's manufactured pressure tactics, because it turned out that the 3 parcels I'd investigated were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern stretching back almost 8 years. At least 11 properties. 11 families, businesses, elderly landowners who had been legally and psychologically coerced into selling at below market value. I connected them to an attorney I trusted, a woman named Patricia Wells who specialized in civil RICO cases and who had, once I described the evidence structure to her, a very specific kind of focused attention. That told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. Second, I made contact with a journalist, not a tabloid reporter, a senior investigative journalist at a regional publication that had broken several significant financial fraud stories in the past decade. I sent her a summary document, carefully redacted, enough to establish credibility, not enough to compromise the legal strategy, and asked if she was interested in a conversation. She called me back in 4 hours. Third, and this was the move that required the most careful thought, I addressed the question of Camille. I had spent those 2 weeks trying to determine, with the same dispassionate rigor I applied to professional investigations, whether my wife had knowingly served as an information source for Calloway, whether she had understood what she was doing when she passed along the detail of my real estate fraud investigation that had led Calloway to call Fitch and threaten his daughter. I did not yet have a definitive answer. What I had was this: a woman who had entered an affair with a man who had used her proximity to me as a surveillance asset, whether she'd understood that's what she was doing, whether she'd been a willing intelligence source or simply an infatuated woman who'd mentioned her husband's work to her. Lover without understanding. The consequences, I genuinely didn't know. What I knew was that she was not my enemy. She was someone who had broken my heart in the most fundamental way a person can break another person's heart. But she was also, potentially, someone who was in over her head with a man far more dangerous than she understood. I made a decision about Camille. I will tell you what that decision was at the end. Meridian Properties held their annual client gala at a downtown hotel on the first Friday of April. It was, by design, exactly the kind of event where Calloway would be comfortable. His territory, his people. A room full of commercial real estate money and the lawyers and bankers who service it. Camille had mentioned the gala weeks earlier. Before the dinner, before any of this, she'd asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I wanted to come. I had said I'd think about it. The morning of the gala, I told her I'd decided to go. Something moved across her face when I said that. Something I didn't have a word for then. Looking back, I think it was fear. It's mostly work people, she said carefully. It might be boring for you. I'll manage, I said. We arrived at 7. The hotel ballroom was exactly what you'd expect. High ceilings, round tables with white linens, a string quartet doing their best to be heard over 200 conversations. Open bar, the gentle roar of professional social performance. I was wearing a dark suit and the particular expression I use when I want people to think I am relaxed. People who know me well know the difference. People who don't know me well generally can't tell. I saw Calloway within 10 minutes of arriving. He was across the room in a cluster of suits, laughing at something with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most powerful person in whatever room he occupied. He saw me at almost exactly the same moment. The laugh didn't stop. He finished it. He raised his glass slightly in my direction, a small, controlled acknowledgement, and he went back to his conversation. He was good. I will give him that. I circulated. I talked to people. I drank sparkling water and smiled, and was, by all appearances, a supportive spouse at his wife's work event. At 8:15, I excused myself from a conversation about Nashville's commercial development pipeline and crossed the room. Calloway saw me coming. He finished his sentence, said something to the people around him, and smoothly stepped to the side, creating a small private space in the geography of the room. He did it well. It looked like two acquaintances finding a moment to chat at a crowded party. Nothing threatening about it. "Mr. Mercer," he said. His voice was warm, controlled, completely at ease. "I wasn't sure you'd come tonight." "I almost didn't," I said. Then I thought, why not? It's an important night. A flicker in his eyes. Just a flicker. "Is it?" "I think so," I said. "Patricia Wells filed a civil complaint this afternoon against Calloway Strategic Partners. RICO statute. 11 property transactions. Going back to 2016, I understand federal prosecutors received a referral this morning as well." Nothing moved in his face. Nothing at all. He was extraordinary. I'll give him that, too. "That sounds like something that should involve my legal team," he said pleasantly. "I'm sure it does," I said. "They've probably been calling you for the last 2 hours. Though I imagine the gala made it easy to miss the calls." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, almost gently, "You understand that the personal dimensions of this situation don't help you. They cloud your judgment, make you look like a man with a personal motive. The personal dimensions of this situation are not relevant to a RICO filing," I said. "The 11 families who lost their properties at coerced prices are relevant. The fabricated legal notices are relevant. The offshore account structure is relevant. My marriage is not." "You're angry," he said. "I'm really not," I said. And it was true. Angry men make mistakes. "I've been very careful." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" he said. Just like that. Direct, finally. The mask slightly adjusted. "Nothing from you," I said. "I want you to understand what's happening so that the next move you make is an informed one. The documentation is filed. The attorney is excellent. The journalist has been briefed. Her story runs Sunday unless legal proceedings make it moot, in which case it'll run anyway as a court coverage piece. And Camille?" he said. It was the first time her name had entered our conversation. He said it deliberately. "Watching me. Camille," I said evenly, "is not your concern anymore." "She'll be questioned," he said. "If this proceeds—" "She'll answer honestly," I said. "Whatever she knows, she'll tell. That's her decision to make." He looked at me for a long time. The practiced ease had gone. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not fear, exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has just had the exit routes he thought he had quietly removed. "You know this will take years," he said. "Even if your documentation is solid. These things take years." "I know," I said. "And your personal life is my business," I said. "Not yours." "Not ever again." I picked up a fresh glass from a passing tray. "Enjoy the gala, Richard," I said, and I walked back across the room. Patricia Wells called me at 10:45 that night. She told me Calloway's legal team had made contact, that they wanted to discuss a settlement framework, that they were, in her words, highly motivated to resolve. I told her to proceed at her judgment. I drove home alone. Camille had stayed at the event with colleagues. She didn't know yet what had happened at the gala. Didn't know what had been set in motion. There was one more conversation left. The hardest one. Camille came home just after midnight. I was sitting in the living room with the lights on, not waiting to ambush her, just awake and not willing to pretend otherwise. She stopped when she saw me. Read the room, the way people do when they've been half expecting a confrontation for a long time, and have been both dreading and, somewhere deeper, almost relieved to have it arrive. She sat down on the couch across from me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" "About the relationship with Calloway?" "Since the morning after the dinner," I said. "About the rest of it? The firm, the properties, the investment structure?" "Longer. I had files on him before I ever met you." She absorbed that. I watched it move through her. "The investigation," she said. 14 months ago." "Yes." A pause. "I didn't know what he was," she said. And her voice. I want to be accurate about this. Her voice didn't carry the defensive urgency of someone constructing an alibi. It carried the flat, exhausted weight of someone telling the truth after a long time of not telling it. I didn't know about the properties, the fraud, any of it. I knew he was powerful, and I knew I was making a terrible choice, and I did it anyway. But I didn't know what he was. "Did you tell him about my investigation?" I said. She looked at me. Her eyes didn't move. "I told him you'd taken on a new real estate fraud case," she said. "I didn't give him a name. I didn't know the name. I mentioned it. I thought it was nothing. I didn't know he would—" She stopped. "You didn't know he would call my client and intimidate him into pulling the contract," I said. She shook her head, slowly, definitively. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. Not because I needed to believe her, but because I had spent 2 weeks applying every investigative tool. I had to this specific question, and everything pointed to the same answer. She was a woman who had made catastrophic personal choices. She was not a woman who had knowingly participated in corporate fraud or targeted intimidation. She had been, in a very real sense, used. "He used you," I said. "He used your proximity to me. He may have started the relationship partly for that reason." Something crossed her face that I don't have a word for. The particular expression of a person, realizing that a betrayal they committed also had them as its victim. She put her face in her hands. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, voice muffled, "Are you going to tell me I need to cooperate with the investigation?" "Patricia Wells will contact you," I said. "What you tell her is your choice. But yes, your testimony about the nature of your relationship with Calloway and what information he may have obtained through you is relevant." She nodded behind her hands. "Daniel," she said, then stopped. "I know," I said, and I did know. I knew what she was trying to say, and I knew that there weren't words adequate to the task. I also knew, with the same clarity, I had brought to every other aspect of this situation, that knowing the truth about someone's actions doesn't automatically resolve what you do next. That understanding how a thing happened doesn't tell you how to feel about it, or what your life looks like on the other side of it. "I think you should stay somewhere else for a while," I said. "Not as punishment. Just because I need time, and I think you do too." She nodded. She went upstairs. She packed a bag. I heard her moving around above me. Careful. Quiet footsteps. The sound of drawers, opening and closing. And I sat in the living room and looked at the life we had built together, all the accumulated objects and textures of 9 years, and I let myself feel all of it without trying to manage it. That, I think, was the hardest thing I did in this entire story. Harder than the investigation, harder than the confrontation, just sitting still with the grief of it. The legal proceedings, as Calloway had predicted, took time. The civil RICO case against Calloway Strategic Partners was filed formally in April. The federal referral led to a grand jury investigation that, by September of the same year, had resulted in indictments on 7 counts, including wire fraud, coercive business practices, and conspiracy. 3 of the 11 families received civil settlements within the first year. The remaining cases were resolved over the following 18 months. Richard Calloway III pled guilty to 2 federal counts in a negotiated plea agreement that, to the frustration of Patricia Wells and several of the original sellers kept him out of prison but included a substantial fine, mandatory dissolution of Callaway Strategic Partners, a 5-year ban from commercial real estate transactions, and a requirement to personally fund a remediation trust for the affected property owners. It was not everything. Justice rarely is in its institutional forms, but it was something real and lasting. 11 families got something back, a structure of coercive fraud that had been operating for almost a decade was dismantled, and a man who had spent decades believing that power and money insulated him from consequence learned in a specific and documented way that there are limits to that insulation. Gerald Fitch provided testimony that was instrumental to the federal case. He did so, I was told, with considerable relief, like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally found somewhere to set it down. Camille and I separated formally in June. Divorce was finalized 11 months later. It was, by the standards of these things, quiet. No dramatic courtroom battles. No scorched earth maneuvering. Just the careful, melancholy work of untangling a life that had been shared and was now going to be lived separately. She cooperated fully with Patricia Wells and the federal investigators. Her testimony was honest and, by all accounts, helpful. It corroborated the timeline in ways that mattered. She lost her position at Meridian Properties, which was, given the firm's subsequent investigation and restructuring, probably inevitable. She took a marketing role with a smaller firm in another city. We have spoken a handful of times since the divorce. The conversations have been civil, careful. The way conversations are when people are trying to honor something that mattered, while also accepting that it's finished. I don't hate her. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect that emotion, and I want to be honest about what's actually there. What I feel toward her is something more like sorrow, the particular sorrow of watching someone you loved make choices that broke the architecture of their own life while also breaking yours. She was not a villain. She was a person who made serious mistakes and paid serious prices. That is, in the end, more painful than hatred. Hatred is clean. Sorrow is not. People ask me, when I tell this story, what I learned. It's a question I used to resist because it felt too neat, like forcing a lesson onto events that were just events, not parables. Life isn't a parable. Things happen to you and you survive them and you change, and sometimes you don't learn anything clean or usable. You just carry what happened and move forward because stopping is not an option. But I've thought about it enough now that I do have an answer. What I learned is this: the things we refuse to look at don't disappear. They don't quietly resolve themselves while we look elsewhere. They accumulate. They compound. They grow in the dark. I was a man who looked at other people's truths for a living and refused to look at my own. I told myself it was trust. It was loyalty. It was giving my marriage the benefit of the doubt. And maybe some of it was. But some of it was also fear. Fear of what I would find. Fear of what finding it would require me to do. And the painful irony is that the skills I used to protect myself, the investigation, the documentation, the careful, methodical reconstruction of what had actually happened, those same skills had been available to me for years, long before the dinner, long before the calendar entries, long before the moment a stranger sat down at my table and reached for his phone. I had the tools. I didn't use them on myself. I use them on myself now. That is the most important thing I do differently. I am still in Nashville. I still do what I do. Corporate investigations, acquisitions analysis, the careful forensic work of finding out what is actually true when the surface of things is dressed to deceive. I am, if anything, better at it than I was before. The thing that happened to me made me better at my job, which is a strange and somewhat dark reward, but it's a real one. I am also, for the first time in a long time, genuinely at peace. Not happy in the uncomplicated, everything is fine sense. I don't think I'll ever be entirely that again. And I'm not sure I'd want to be that particular kind of happiness. I've learned often involves refusing to see things clearly, but at peace with what happened, with who I am, with the fact that the truth, even when it costs you everything, is the only thing worth standing on. The dinner that changed my life happened on a Thursday in March. A man sat at my table, looked at my face, and called his lawyer. And in doing so, he started a process that ended him and freed me. I think about that sometimes. about the strange accidental justice of it. He came to my house to assess his risk. He left having created it. Karma doesn't always arrive the way you expect it. Sometimes it arrives at 7:32 on a Thursday evening, wearing a nice suit and bringing wine, and sometimes the person it comes for isn't the one you think. This story is finished, but my story is just beginning.